The floors at Whetstone Academy were marble in the main hall, linoleum in the dormitory wings, and poured concrete in the basement utility corridors. I say this because after 14 years of mopping, waxing, and buffing those surfaces, the material under my feet told me where I was in the building more reliably than any sign on the wall. I knew the place the way you know your own body, not intellectually but physically, through repetition so deep it had become a kind of second skeleton. Every drain that backed up in October, every window latch that stuck when humidity climbed above 60%, every radiator that clanked at 3 a.m. in the east wing because air had crept into the line. I knew which stairwell doors could be wedged shut with a folded beer coaster, and which ones needed the deadbolt thrown from the custodial keyring I carried on a retractable clip at my hip. None of that knowledge was important until April 11th. After that, it was the only thing that mattered. Whetstone Academy sits on 42 acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside, about 90 minutes northwest of Philadelphia. It's a private boarding school, grades 6 through 12, with a student body that hovered around 310 that semester. The campus is 6 buildings, arranged roughly in a horseshoe around a central lawn. The main academic hall at the crown, 2 dormitory wings curving south on either side, a dining hall connecting to the main hall's east face, a gymnasium and natatorium on the west, and a small administrative cottage set apart near the front gate. The whole property is enclosed by a 6-foot wrought iron fence that was decorative rather than defensive, the kind of thing that looks stately in the admissions brochure and stops absolutely nothing that actually wants to get through. I was 47 years old that April. Divorced 8 years, no children of my own, living in a converted garage apartment in Collegeville that I rented month to month. I'd worked maintenance and custodial jobs since I was 19. Whetstone was the longest I'd stayed anywhere. Not because the pay was exceptional, but because the rhythm suited me. I started my shift at 6 in the morning, finished at 2 in the afternoon, and spent those 8 hours mostly alone in hallways and mechanical rooms, while 300 teenagers swirled through the building around me like water around a stone. They didn't see me. I don't say that with bitterness. It's simply accurate. To a 16-year-old boarding student, the janitor is part of the infrastructure. You notice the mop bucket the way you notice a door frame, only when you walk into it. April 11th was a Friday. I remember because Fridays meant the dining hall got heavy use for the weekend kickoff dinner, and I always pre-staged extra trash bags and mopped the kitchen corridor before the catering staff arrived at 4. I was in the basement mechanical room at 11:40 a.m., replacing a circulator pump gasket on the hot water loop that fed the east dormitory showers, when my phone buzzed with a county emergency alert. I glanced at it the way you glance at a weather warning. A quick read, a mental note, back to work. The message said something about a public health emergency and shelter-in-place advisory for Chester and Montgomery counties. I assumed chemical spill. There'd been one 2 years earlier when a tanker jackknifed on Route 422, and the alert language was similar. At 11:55, a second alert came through. This one used the word violent. At 12:10, a third alert used the word fatal and instructed all residents to lock doors and avoid physical contact with anyone exhibiting erratic behavior. I set down my wrench and climbed the basement stairs to the main hall. The school was in the strange early phase of disruption where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one has committed to the idea that it's serious. Students were clustered in hallways looking at their phones. A few teachers stood in classroom doorways doing the same. I found the head of facilities, Ray Dominic, in the custodial office near the dining hall. Ray was watching a live news broadcast on his phone, shaky helicopter footage of a highway somewhere, vehicles stopped in both lanes, people running between cars. The chyron at the bottom of the screen said, "Multiple casualty incident. Sources report aggressive unknown pathogen." Ray looked at me and said, "They're saying it's in Philly already." By 12:30, the headmaster, Dr. Lena Strauss, had activated the school's lockdown protocol. This was a procedure designed for an active shooter scenario. It involved locking exterior doors, drawing classroom blinds, and keeping students in place with their current teacher. It was not designed for what was actually happening, but it was the only institutional tool anyone had. The front gate was closed and latched. The exterior doors on all 6 buildings were locked from the inside. Teachers took attendance in their classrooms and reported numbers to the front office by intercom. Within 30 minutes, Whetstone Academy was sealed. Here is what we had inside that seal. 308 students, ages 11 to 18. 26 teachers and academic staff. 12 administrative and support staff, including me, Ray, 2 other custodians, 4 kitchen workers, and 4 people in the front office. The school nurse, Patricia Mooney. 2 residential advisors who lived on campus in the dormitory wings. That put our total at 349 people, of whom 308 were children. Here is what we did not have: any plan for sustaining that population if the lockdown lasted more than a few hours. The dining hall kitchen held food for approximately 2 days of normal meal service. The infirmary had basic first aid supplies and a small stock of common medications: ibuprofen, antihistamines, EpiPens, inhalers for the asthmatic students. There were no weapons beyond the tools in my maintenance shop. There was no backup generator. The school had been approved for one in the previous year's budget, but installation was scheduled for the summer. If we lost grid power, we lost everything electric: lights, kitchen equipment, the water pumps that fed the upper floors from the well system. The first 3 hours felt manageable. Students stayed in classrooms. Teachers maintained calm through the familiar authority of routine. Assignments were given, voices stayed level. The intercom carried periodic updates from Dr. Strauss that said very little, but said it in a tone that suggested someone was in charge. I spent those hours doing what I knew how to do: checking every exterior door, every ground floor window, every basement access point. I walked the perimeter of the main building inside, testing locks, noting which windows had functional latches and which I'd been meaning to fix for months. I made a mental list, then a written one. Ray joined me for part of the circuit, and when we got back to the custodial office, I taped the list to the wall and started categorizing: secure, fixable, vulnerable. At 3:15 p.m., one of the kitchen workers, a woman named Dina, came to find me. She said 2 parents had arrived at the front gate in a car, demanding to pick up their daughter. Dr. Strauss was at the gate, talking to them through the iron bars. I walked out with Dina and got there in time to see the conversation collapse. The father was shouting. The mother was crying. Dr. Strauss was explaining that the lockdown protocol did not permit opening the gates, that the county advisory was still active, that releasing any student before official clearance would expose the school to liability. The father said something about liability not mattering if everyone was dead. Dr. Strauss said she understood his concern. The father reached through the bars and grabbed her arm. I was the one who separated them. Not violently. I stepped between the bars and the headmaster, put my hand flat on the man's chest and said, "Sir, step back." He looked at me the way people always looked at me, like he was trying to place what part of the furniture had just spoken to him. He let go. Dr. Strauss straightened her blazer and told the parents to go home, that their daughter was safe, that the school would contact them when conditions changed. They left. I watched their car accelerate down the access road faster than anyone should drive on gravel. That night, everything changed. Not at Whetstone specifically. The change was everywhere, but we felt it arrive in stages. First, the cell networks became unreliable, calls dropping or failing to connect. Then the internet slowed to a crawl. and died entirely by 8 p.m. The local television stations we could pick up on the dining hall's wall-mounted TV cycled through the same footage with increasingly urgent language, until, around 9:30 p.m., the broadcast cut to a static emergency screen with a scrolling text advisory that repeated the shelter-in-place order and added a new instruction. Do not approach any individual displaying signs of aggression, disorientation, or visible wounds. If approached, flee. Do not attempt to restrain or assist. At 10:15 p.m., we heard gunfire from the direction of the county road. Not close, maybe a mile, maybe two, but unmistakable. Several long volleys, then silence. A few of the older students had gathered in the dining hall, and I watched their faces when the sound reached us. They didn't scream or panic. They just went very still, the way animals go still. And I realized that whatever illusion of normalcy we'd been maintaining had evaporated with those distant reports. Dr. Strauss held a staff meeting in the faculty lounge at 11 p.m. She looked composed, but her hands were trembling. She laid out the situation as she understood it. Communications were down. The emergency they'd locked down against appeared to be regional or larger. No official response or rescue had materialized, and the school needed to prepare for the possibility that the lockdown would extend beyond the weekend. She asked for a supply inventory. She asked for a security assessment. She asked for a plan to manage 308 students through an indefinite confinement. Nobody had answers. The teachers looked at each other. The residential advisors looked at the teachers. Ray looked at me. I don't know why I spoke. It wasn't courage or ambition. It was the specific, narrow confidence of a man who knows his building. I said, "The kitchen has roughly 48 hours of food at full service. If we cut portions to survival rations, we can stretch that to 5 or 6 days. The well pump runs on grid power, so if we lose electricity, we lose water pressure above the first floor within an hour. But the basement has a manual hand pump tied to the same well that can deliver about 3 gallons per minute. Every exterior door on the main hall and dining hall is steel core and can be deadbolted from inside. The dormitory wings have fire exits with push-bar hardware that can't be locked from inside by design. Those are our weak points. I can disable the push-bar mechanisms on 6 of the 8 fire exits by tomorrow morning and leave 2 functional for emergency egress. The gym has a roll-up loading door for equipment delivery that's held by a chain hoist. I can weld that shut if someone can find me a portable welder, or I can lag bolt steel plate across it from the inside. The windows on the ground floor are single-pane institutional glass and will not stop anything that wants through them. We need to board them. I have enough plywood in the shop for maybe 40% of the ground floor windows. The rest, we improvise. The room was quiet. Dr. Strauss stared at me for a long moment and then said, "What's your name again?" "Marcus Bowen." "Marcus, can you start tonight?" I started that night. Ray and the other 2 custodians, Phil Meeker and a young guy named Darren, helped me disable the push-bar fire exits first. It was straightforward mechanical work. Remove the bar assembly, drill through the door and frame, drive lag bolts home. Each door took about 20 minutes. By 2 a.m., we'd locked down 6 of the 8 exits and left the 2 nearest the central stairwells functional for evacuation if we needed them. Then we started on the ground floor windows. Plywood first on the most exposed faces, the north side of the main hall, which fronted the access road, and the ground floor of the dining hall, which had large service windows near the loading dock. We worked by flashlight to avoid drawing attention, screwing sheets of 3/4-inch plywood directly into the window frames. That first night established a pattern that would hold for weeks. The teachers managed the children. I managed the building. Dr. Strauss managed the interface between the two. It was not a hierarchy anyone had designed, and it was not stable, but it was functional. And in those early days, functional was the only standard that mattered. Saturday morning, we saw our first infected. A man, middle-aged, wearing a torn golf shirt and khaki shorts, walking across the front lawn toward the main entrance. Walking is the wrong word. He was moving with that stuttering, locked joint gait that I'd seen on the news footage the day before, but hadn't fully believed was real until I watched it happen 30 yards from the window I was boarding. His head was tilted at an angle that suggested his neck muscles were no longer operating symmetrically. There was blood on his hands and down the front of his shirt, though I couldn't tell whether it was his own. He reached the main entrance, pressed against the glass doors, and stayed there. He didn't pound or scratch or throw himself at the barrier. He just leaned into it with a steady, mindless pressure, like water finding a crack. I watched from the second-floor hallway with Ray and Dr. Strauss. None of us spoke. After about 10 minutes, the man shifted sideways along the building face, pressing against each window he passed, and eventually moved around the corner toward the east wing. We followed his progress from window to window like birders tracking a rare species. Except the feeling in my chest was the opposite of fascination. It was the feeling of a man who has just realized the container he's standing inside is no longer theoretical. Dr. Strauss turned to me and said, "How fast can you finish the rest of those windows?" I finished them in 2 days, using every sheet of plywood in the shop and then dismantling bookshelves, workbenches, and the theater department's flat storage to get enough material. The older students helped, not because I asked, but because a 17-year-old named Tomas Reyes appeared in the shop doorway on Saturday afternoon and said, "I know how to use a drill." Within an hour, he'd recruited 8 more upperclassmen, and we had a crew. I showed them how to measure, cut, and fasten. They worked hard, and they worked quietly. And I noticed that the physical labor did something for them that sitting in a classroom waiting for news could not. It gave them a role. It converted fear into motion. The first real crisis came on day 4, a Tuesday. Power went out at 6:12 a.m. without warning. No flicker, no surge, just instant darkness. The dormitory wings erupted. 300 children waking in pitch blackness in a building they already understood was under siege. The sound that traveled through the corridors was not screaming exactly. It was a kind of collective vocal surge, hundreds of voices rising simultaneously. And it was loud enough that I heard it from the basement where I'd been checking the sump pump. I grabbed 2 flashlights and ran upstairs. The next 40 minutes were the closest we came to losing control entirely. Children were in the hallways, some crying, some running, some frozen in place. A group of 8th graders had barricaded themselves in a bathroom and were refusing to come out. 2 boys on the 3rd floor of the West dormitory had broken a window trying to see outside, and the sound of breaking glass triggered a stampede on the stairwell that resulted in a 12-year-old girl named Priya Chandrasekaran falling and fracturing her wrist. Patricia Mooney, the nurse, set the fracture with a splint made from a ruler and athletic tape, and the calm precision with which she did it, talking to Priya the entire time in a voice that never wavered, was the most impressive thing I saw anyone do in those first days. I got the hand pump in the basement operational within an hour. Water was restored to the 1st floor only. The upper floors would need to be served by bucket brigade, which became a permanent daily task assigned to rotating teams of students. Lighting was solved partially by the emergency battery units mounted in every hallway, which provided dim illumination for about 8 hours before dying, and then by candles from the chapel, flashlights from my shop, and eventually a system of reflective panels that a physics teacher named Dr. Adebayo rigged using mirrors salvaged from the dormitory bathrooms to channel daylight deep into interior corridors. But the loss of power meant the loss of the kitchen's refrigeration and cooking equipment. The remaining perishable food had to be consumed or discarded within 24 hours. Dina and the kitchen staff organized a massive cook-off using the gas range, which still functioned since the school's propane tank was independent of the electrical grid. Everything that would spoil was prepared and served in a single enormous meal, the last hot meal most of those children would eat for weeks. After that, we were down to dry goods, canned supplies, and whatever could be prepared without electricity. I sat in the custodial office that Tuesday night and did the math on a sheet of yellow legal paper. 349 people. Remaining food stores. Approximately 1,800 pounds of dry and canned goods, plus whatever was in the vending machines I'd pried open that afternoon. At survival rations, roughly 1,200 calories per person per day, which was already a deficit for growing teenagers, we had between 8 and 10 days. After that, we would begin starving. I brought the numbers to Dr. Strauss. She read them in silence, then asked me what I recommended. I told her we needed to send a scavenging team outside the fence. There was a small grocery store in the village of Pine Hill, about 2 miles east along the county road, and a larger wholesale supply warehouse in Collegeville, about 6 miles south. Either would extend our timeline significantly if it hadn't already been emptied. She said, "Who would go?" I said, "I would. I know the roads. I have the keys to the maintenance truck in the motor pool." She said, "I can't authorize a staff member to leave the campus." I said, "Dr. Strauss, in 8 days we start watching children go hungry. You can authorize it, or I can go without authorization, but either way, someone has to go." She authorized it. I took Ray and Tomas Reyes, the 17-year-old who'd become my de facto crew leader, and we left through the South Service Gate at 4:30 a.m. on Wednesday, day 5. We took the maintenance truck, a white Ford F-250 with the school crest on the doors. I drove. Ray sat passenger with a fire axe across his knees. Tomas sat in the back seat and said nothing the entire drive. The county road was empty in the pre-dawn dark. Not empty the way a rural road is empty at night. Empty the way a place is empty when everyone who lived near it is either dead or gone. We passed 3 houses with their doors standing open. We passed a car nosed into a ditch with its headlights still on, both front doors ajar, nobody inside. We passed a dog sitting in the middle of the road that watched us drive by without moving. Pine Hill was a town of about 400 people, and it had already been picked over. The grocery store's front windows were smashed. Inside, the shelves were mostly bare, but we found cases of canned vegetables and beans in the back stockroom that looters had apparently overlooked or couldn't be bothered to carry. We loaded the truck bed with everything edible. It took 40 minutes. During that time, we saw no one, living or otherwise, but the smell in the town was wrong. Sweet and heavy and chemical, like the rendering plant I'd worked at briefly in my 20s. I did not investigate its source. We made it back to Whetstone by 7:15 a.m. with approximately 600 pounds of canned goods. It bought us 4 additional days. I made 3 more supply runs over the following 2 weeks. The second one, to the Collegeville warehouse, nearly ended us. We got there and found it occupied. Not by infected, but by a group of 11 adults who had claimed the building as their own and were not interested in sharing. Their spokesperson, a heavy man in a hunting vest, stood at the loading dock with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm and told us to leave. I looked at the warehouse behind him. Pallets of food, water, supplies that could sustain our 300 children for months, and I felt something shift inside me. Not rage exactly, something colder. An arithmetic that said his 11 against our 300, and the scales were not even close. But I left. I left because Tomas was with me, and because starting a war over food with a teenager in my truck was not a decision I was willing to make. We drove back in silence, and I told Dr. Strauss what had happened, and she said, "We'll find another way." I wanted to believe her. I'm not sure I did. By the end of the second week, the school had reorganized itself into something I wouldn't have predicted. The formal hierarchy, headmaster, teachers, staff, still existed on paper, but the operational reality had shifted. Dr. Strauss remained the voice of authority and made the announcements and held the evening assemblies in the dining hall, where she updated everyone on our situation with a candor I respected. The teachers maintained the daily schedule. Yes, there were still classes, because Dr. Adebayo argued persuasively that cognitive routine was the most important psychological tool we had, and he was right. Patricia Mooney ran the infirmary with quiet ferocity, rationing medications and training a team of older students in basic wound care and hygiene protocols. And then there was me. I don't know what to call what I became. I wasn't the leader. Dr. Strauss was the leader. I was something more like the building's immune system. The person who understood the physical structure well enough to keep it functioning as a survival container. I managed the water brigade, the window integrity, the door security, the food storage, the sanitation system I'd improvised using the basement utility drains and a gravity-fed waste line that ran to the campus septic field. I coordinated the supply runs. I organized the night watch, rotating shifts of staff and older students who patrolled the interior perimeter from dusk to dawn, checking every boarded window and locked door. I carried the key ring. I carried the building. The children adapted faster than the adults. This was the thing that surprised me most, though maybe it shouldn't have. An 11-year-old has fewer assumptions to dismantle. The younger students, the 6th and 7th graders, wove the new reality into their existing social fabric within days. They formed work crews with the earnestness of kids playing a game. Except the game was hauling water buckets up 3 flights of stairs, or sorting canned goods by calorie density. They gave their crews names. They competed for efficiency. A pair of 12-year-old girls named Sophie and Min organized the entire food inventory into a color-coded system using markers stolen from the art room. And their system was more accurate and more useful than anything the adults had devised. The older students were harder. Not because they were less capable, many of them were extraordinarily capable, but because they were old enough to understand the full scope of what was happening and young enough to lack the emotional calluses that adults develop to manage that understanding. The juniors and seniors knew they might never see their families again. They knew the food math as well as I did. They processed that knowledge in different ways. Some, like Tomas, channeled it into work. Others withdrew. A few became volatile. The first serious internal conflict happened on day 12. A group of 5 senior boys, led by a student named Drew Halford, confronted me in the dining hall during the evening meal. Drew was 18, athletic, and accustomed to a certain social position in the school's ecosystem. He wanted to know why the adults were making all the decisions. He wanted to know why the food was being rationed equally when, as he put it, the little kids don't need as many calories as we do. He wanted to know why he and his friends couldn't take the truck and drive to their families. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Drew, you're right that you need more calories than an 11-year-old. So do I. But if we distribute by need, we start making judgments about whose hunger matters more. And that road leads somewhere I won't take 300 kids. As for the truck, the keys are right here." I tapped my hip. "You're welcome to ask me for them. But if you take that truck, you take one of our 2 vehicles. You take fuel we can't replace. And the 307 people still inside this building lose a supply line. That's the math. You can be angry at me for it, that's fine. But the math doesn't change because you're angry. Drew stared at me for a long time. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not whether I was right, but whether he could take the keys from a 47-year-old janitor if he decided to. I'm not a large man, and Drew had 6 inches and 40 pounds on me. But something in my expression or my stillness apparently communicated that the attempt would cost more than he wanted to pay, because he turned and walked away. His friends followed. That confrontation taught me something I carried for the rest of our time at Whetstone. Authority in that building didn't come from title or physical dominance. It came from demonstrated knowledge. The children, all of them, from the youngest to Drew Halford, obeyed the systems I built because those systems visibly kept them alive. Every morning when the water arrived on the upper floors, that was my credibility. Every night when the watch reported all doors secure, that was my mandate. It was the most honest form of leadership I'd ever encountered, and it was completely exhausting, because it meant that a single failure, one breached window, one missed threat, one empty meal, would dissolve the entire basis of trust. The infected tested us regularly. Not in organized assaults, they weren't capable of that as far as I could tell. They wandered the campus grounds in ones and twos, and occasionally in groups of 6 or 8, drawn by sound or light or some instinct I never understood. Most of the time they pressed against the building's exterior and eventually moved on. But on day 18, a group of 11 found the south service gate, which I'd chained shut but hadn't reinforced because the iron was thick enough that I thought it would hold. It held, but the noise of 11 bodies pressing against chain link for 6 continuous hours created a sound environment inside the south dormitory that was psychologically devastating. Children on that side of the building couldn't sleep. 2 of the younger students had what Patricia called acute stress episodes: uncontrollable shaking, hyperventilation, inability to speak. I spent that night on the ground floor of the south wing with a fire axe and a flashlight, not because I could do anything about the infected on the other side of the wall, but because being visible and calm in the space where the fear was worst seemed to matter to the children who could see me. On day 21, we lost our first person inside the walls. Not to infection, to something more ordinary and more terrible. Martin Hale, the residential advisor for the East Dormitory, had a heart attack in his apartment at 3 a.m. Patricia Mooney responded within minutes, but had no cardiac equipment, no defibrillator, no drugs. Martin was 56 and had apparently been managing a heart condition with medication that ran out on day 14. He died on the floor of his apartment while Patricia performed chest compressions, and a 14-year-old boy who'd heard the commotion watched from the hallway. We buried Martin in the garden behind the chapel. I dug the grave myself because the ground was still soft from spring rain, and because I needed to do something physical with the grief. 30 students attended the burial. Dr. Strauss read something from the chapel Bible. I stood at the edge of the grave and thought about the fact that Martin had told no one his medication was gone. He'd rationed it, stretched it, and when it ran out, he simply continued performing his duties and waited for the organ inside his chest to make its own decision. I don't know if that was bravery or resignation. I don't know if there's a difference. After Martin, things got harder in ways I hadn't anticipated. The adults began to fracture. Not dramatically, no one screamed or broke down in front of the students. But I could see the accumulation of strain in the way Ray started drinking from a bottle of cleaning solvent he'd distilled into something approximately alcoholic. In the way Phil Meeker stopped showing up for his maintenance shifts and had to be found sitting in the boiler room, staring at nothing. In the way Dr. Strauss's evening addresses grew shorter and more formulaic, as if the reservoir of reassurance she'd been drawing from had reached its silt layer. I was not immune. I want to be honest about that. There were nights in the custodial office, my de facto quarters, since I'd given my participation in the dormitory sleeping arrangements to a teacher who needed a private space to cry without the students hearing. When I sat in the dark and felt the weight of the building press down on me as though it were physical. 308 children, each one a name, a face, a set of parents somewhere who might or might not be alive, a future that might or might not exist. And me, a man whose greatest professional achievement prior to April 11th had been keeping the third-floor boys' bathroom from flooding during homecoming week, standing between all of them and whatever was outside those boarded windows. The absurdity of it would hit me in waves, followed by something that wasn't absurdity at all, but its opposite. The grim, heavy recognition that, absurd or not, I was the one who knew where the shutoff valves were, and that made me necessary. And necessity is its own kind of trap. Day 26 brought the supply crisis I'd been dreading. We were down to roughly 3 days of food. The previous 2 scavenging runs had yielded diminishing returns. The nearby area had been stripped clean by other survivors or by the same group at the Collegeville warehouse, whose territory seemed to be expanding. I laid out our options for Dr. Strauss, Patricia, Dr. Adebayo, and Tomas, who had by then become a permanent member of the decision-making circle regardless of his age. Option 1. Another run, farther out, higher risk. Option 2. Begin harvesting the campus itself, the ornamental plantings, the athletic field grass seed, the koi in the decorative pond near the front gate. Option 3. Reduce rations further, below the threshold of what growing bodies could sustain, and accept that children would begin showing symptoms of malnutrition within a week. Tomas said, "There's a 4th option. Reduce the population." The room went silent. He didn't mean violence. He meant that if we sent a group out, the oldest students, the ones most capable of traveling, we could reduce the number of mouths inside the building and potentially establish a second location with its own supply source. It was logical. It was also the suggestion of a 17-year-old who was volunteering to be among those sent out. And I could see in his face that the logic was partly a vehicle for something else. The unbearable passivity of waiting inside walls for a rescue that was obviously not coming. Dr. Strauss vetoed it immediately. No child leaves this campus. Tomas said, "I'm 17. In 4 months I'd be, no child leaves this campus." That was the end of the discussion. We went with options 1 and 2 simultaneously. I took the truck out the next morning, alone this time, because I didn't want to risk anyone else on what I suspected would be a dry run. I drove 12 miles south to a farm supply store I remembered from years ago. It had been looted, but the attached warehouse still held 50-pound bags of livestock feed, corn and oat mix intended for cattle. It was not designed for human consumption. It would keep 300 children alive. I loaded the truck until the suspension groaned and drove back to Whetstone with enough calories to buy us another 2 weeks, provided no one thought too carefully about what they were eating. Dina performed miracles with that feed, mixing it with the last of the flour and canned fruit to produce something that was technically edible and tasted like penance. Meanwhile, Dr. Adebayo and a team of students had begun what they called the Garden Project, tearing up the central lawn and the decorative beds to plant fast-growing vegetables from seed packets salvaged from the science department's botany supplies. It was too early in the season for most crops, and the yield would be months away. But the act of planting, of investing in a future, did something to the collective psychology that no assembly speech or rationing system could accomplish. I watched a 15-year-old boy named Jerome, who had not spoken to anyone in 11 days, spend an entire afternoon on his knees in the dirt planting radish seeds with the focused attention of a surgeon. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, "These come up in 25 days, Mr. Bowen." It was the first time any student had called me by name. Day 33. The event that broke the school's psychological equilibrium and forced everything that followed. It was a Sunday, mid-morning. I was in the basement checking the hand pump when I heard running footsteps above me, the distinctive sound of a child sprinting on marble. Then shouting. Then a sound I had never heard before and hope never to hear again. The collective scream of hundreds of children. Not the panicked surge of the power outage, but something sharper and more primal. A sound that contained recognition. I took the stairs 3 at a time. The main hall was chaos. Students were running toward the east dormitory wing, and I pushed against the current until I reached the source and understood. One of the boarded windows on the east wing's ground floor had failed. Not because the plywood gave way, because the window frame itself, old wood softened by decades of moisture, had pulled free from the masonry when a group of infected pushed against it. The plywood, the glass, and the frame had come inward as a single unit, leaving a 4-foot opening in the wall of the building. 2 infected were already inside. A third was climbing through. The east wing ground floor was the 6th grade dormitory. There were 31 11-year-olds living in that corridor. I don't remember deciding to act. I remember the fire axe in my hands. I'd been carrying it everywhere since week 2, leaned against whatever wall I was working near. And I remember the sound it made. And I remember that the infected were slower indoors than I'd expected, disoriented by the transition from daylight to the dim interior. The first one went down in the corridor before it reached any of the dormitory rooms. The second had entered a room. I followed it in and found it standing over a bed where a boy named Elijah Porter was curled in a ball with his blanket pulled over his head, as if the blanket were a shield, as if the fabric could save him. The infected was reaching for him. I swung the axe from behind, and the thing fell across the foot of the bed, and Elijah did not move or uncover his head or make any sound at all. The third infected was stopped by Tomas and 2 other seniors in the hallway. They used a desk and a length of pipe. It was not clean. Nothing about any of it was clean. I stood in that corridor afterward with blood on my hands and shirt, and the axe still raised, and 31 11-year-olds staring at me from doorways. And I understood that whatever I had been to these children before, a background figure, a name they'd recently learned, the man who brought water and checked the doors, I was now something else. I was the man who killed the things that came through the walls. I was the man who stood between them and the opening. I was the barrier. It was a role I had not asked for and did not want and could not refuse. We sealed the breach within 2 hours. Steel plate from the shop, lag-bolted through the masonry on either side of the failed frame. I reinforced every other ground floor window on the east wing the same way, working through the night with Tomas and his crew. By morning, the east wing was more secure than it had been before the breach. But the damage was not structural. It was psychological. The building had been penetrated. The container had proven permeable. Every child in Whetstone now knew, in their bodies rather than their minds, that the walls could fail. Elijah Porter did not speak for 9 days after the breach. On the 10th day, he came to the custodial office, stood in the doorway, and asked me if he could help with the water brigade. I said yes. He became one of the most reliable members of the bucket team, carrying loads up 3 flights of stairs without complaint every morning, and he never once mentioned what had happened in his room. I thought about that often. The way children metabolize horror, not by processing it, but by covering it over with purpose. The way a tree grows bark over a wound. Whether that's healing or just concealment, I still don't know. Day 40. The radio. Dr. Adebayo had been tinkering with a hand-crank emergency radio from the science lab since the 2nd week, trying to pick up any broadcast signal. Most of the AM and FM band was dead, static or automated loops that sounded increasingly ghostly as the weeks passed. But on day 40, he found a signal on a shortwave frequency that was unmistakably live. A human voice, male, calm, repeating a message on a loop with enough variation to prove it wasn't recorded. The message said that a survivor settlement had been established at a decommissioned Army National Guard facility in Indiantown Gap, approximately 70 miles northwest of our location. It said the facility had shelter, food, medical supplies, and military-grade perimeter security. It said survivors were welcome. It gave coordinates and a route: 70 miles. With a truck that had a quarter tank of fuel and a campus full of children who'd never walked farther than the athletic fields. The debate that followed was the most difficult conversation of the entire ordeal. Dr. Strauss wanted to stay. The school was defensible. The garden was planted. We had survived 6 weeks. Leaving meant exposing 300 children to the open road, to infected, to the unknown. Patricia Mooney wanted to go. She'd been tracking the children's health metrics, and the trend was unambiguous. Weight loss accelerating, immune function declining. 2 cases of what she suspected was early scurvy from vitamin deficiency. The livestock feed and canned goods were keeping them alive, but not nourishing them. Without fresh food, medical supplies, or reliable shelter through the coming winter, the school would become a hospice. I did not advocate. I presented the logistics. 70 miles overland with 300 children would take a minimum of 5 days on foot, assuming we could maintain a pace of 14 miles per day, which we could not with the youngest students. The truck could make one trip, carrying perhaps 40 people and supplies, then would need to return for more, assuming the route was passable and the fuel held. Alternatively, we could send a small advance team to confirm the settlement was real and then organize a staged evacuation. Tomas said, "If we send a small team and they don't come back, we've lost our best people and learned nothing." Dr. Adebayo said, "If we go all at once and the settlement doesn't exist, we've abandoned our only defensible position for nothing." The conversation circled for hours. In the end, the decision was made not by argument, but by event. On day 42, the propane tank ran dry. Without gas, the kitchen lost its last cooking capability. We were eating uncooked livestock feed mixed with cold canned fruit. Morale, already fragile, collapsed into something quieter and more dangerous: resignation. I watched it spread through the student body like a secondary infection. Children stopped reporting for their work crews. The water brigade had to be restructured because half the team simply didn't show up. In the dining hall, students sat with their plates of cold mush and stared at the table, and the silence was worse than any scream. I went to Dr. Strauss that evening and said, "We go. All of us. We leave in 3 days." She said, "What if it's not real?" I said, "Then we'll be 70 miles from here with 300 children and no shelter. And it will be my responsibility. But if we stay here, I can tell you exactly what happens, because I've been watching it happen for 6 weeks. We starve slowly and call it safety." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she nodded. The evacuation of Whetstone Academy took 3 days to plan and 1 day to execute. I organized the students into travel groups of 20, each led by an adult or a senior student. Every group carried a 3-day food supply, water, a first aid kit assembled by Patricia, and a hand-drawn map of the route that Dr. Adebayo and I had plotted using a road atlas from the school library. The truck would carry the youngest and least mobile children, the 6th graders and any student with an injury or illness, along with the bulk of our supplies. It would drive ahead to a designated waypoint, unload, and return for the next group. I calculated that the truck could make 3 round trips per day if the roads were clear, leapfrogging groups forward in stages. We left Whetstone Academy at 5:15 a.m. on day 45. I stood at the South Service Gate and watched 308 children file through it in a column that stretched back through the campus like a living thread being pulled from the building's body. They carried backpacks and blankets and water bottles. Some of the younger ones carried stuffed animals they'd had since the first night of lockdown. The older students walked at the edges of the column, flanking the younger ones without being told to, a protective instinct that no one had assigned, but everyone understood. Tomas walked point with me. Dr. Strauss walked at the center of the column. Patricia moved up and down the line like a sheepdog, checking faces, checking feet, checking the quiet ones who might be hiding an injury or an illness because they didn't want to slow the group down. The first day was the easiest, which is to say it was merely grueling rather than catastrophic. We covered 9 miles on a county road that wound through farmland and sparse woodland. The truck made its first relay successfully, carrying 32 sixth graders and Dina to a waypoint at an abandoned gas station, then returning for the next load. The weather held, overcast, cool, no rain. We saw infected twice at a distance, both times solitary figures in open fields who turned toward the sound of our passage but were too far away to reach us before we moved on. I kept the column tight, kept the pace steady, and kept my voice calm when I spoke to the children nearest me, which was the hardest performance of composure I have ever given. The second day nearly broke us. The truck threw a rod on its 4th relay trip and died on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway 6 miles ahead of the main column. Darren, who'd been driving, radioed back on the pair of walkie-talkies we'd taken from the school's emergency kit. I heard the panic in his voice before he said a word. Without the truck, the youngest children and our bulk supplies were stranded at the forward waypoint, and the main column was still 4 miles behind with no vehicle support. I made the decision in less than a minute, because there was no time for debate, and because the mathematics were absolute. The main column would continue on foot to the forward waypoint. There we would consolidate, redistribute supplies into what could be carried by hand, and continue as a single group. The youngest children who could not walk the remaining distance would be carried. Every adult and every senior student would take a child on their back or in their arms if necessary. We would not leave anyone behind, and we would not stop moving. It took us 11 hours to cover those 4 miles and consolidate. 11 hours for what should have been a 90-minute walk, because the column moved at the pace of its slowest member. And its slowest member was an 11-year-old girl with a sprained ankle, who refused to be carried and refused to stop walking, making her way forward on a stick that Tomas cut from a roadside branch. Her jaw set in an expression I will never forget, because it contained more resolve than I have ever seen on a human face of any age. That night, we camped in a cleared field beside a creek. No tents. We hadn't brought any. 308 children slept on the ground under blankets and jackets, while the adults and senior students kept watch in a perimeter that I knew was inadequate, but maintained anyway because the alternative was no perimeter at all. The night was cold. Not dangerously cold, but cold enough that the younger children clustered together for warmth in piles that looked, from a distance, like something you'd see in a nature documentary about animals huddling against winter. I walked the perimeter all night. I did not sleep. I'm not sure I could have. Day 3 on the road. We were moving by dawn, stiff and slow and silent. The column had changed character overnight. The nervous energy of the first day and the crisis adrenaline of the second had burned off, leaving something rawer and more fundamental. The children walked because walking was the only option. They didn't complain, didn't ask how far, didn't ask when. They walked. I've thought about that many times since, and I think what I was witnessing was the moment when 300 children collectively decided to survive not as an aspiration, but as a practice. They put one foot in front of the other because that was the task, and the task was the only thing that existed. We encountered our first serious infected presence at a crossroads about 40 miles into the journey. A group of perhaps 20 clustered around an overturned delivery truck in the intersection, feeding on something I told the children not to look at, and most of them obeyed. We detoured through a field, adding 2 miles to the route but avoiding contact entirely. The infected noticed our movement. Several heads turned, that awful mechanical rotation, but they did not pursue. Whether this was because we were too far away, or because whatever they were consuming held more immediate appeal, I don't know. I was grateful for the outcome without wanting to understand its cause. That afternoon, we met other survivors for the first time since leaving Whetstone. A family of 4, 2 adults, 2 teenagers, emerged from a farmhouse as our column passed. They stood in their yard and watched 300 children walk by in stunned silence. And then the mother ran inside and came back with a case of bottled water and a box of granola bars and handed them to the nearest student without saying a word. The father asked where we were going. I told him about the Indian Town Gap signal. He went back inside and came out 10 minutes later with a packed bag, and his family joined the end of our column. They were not the last. Over the next 2 days, 11 more people attached themselves to our group. Couples, singles, a woman with an infant who Patricia took under immediate care. Our column grew from 349 to 364, and each addition felt less like a burden than a confirmation. On the afternoon of day 5, we crested a ridge on a secondary road and saw it below us. The Indian Town Gap facility, a sprawling complex of low buildings behind a double perimeter of concrete barriers and razor wire, with guard towers at the corners and vehicles moving inside the fence. A flag was flying, American, full-sized, visible from a mile away. There were people on the walls, living people, standing upright, watching us approach. I stopped the column. 364 people halted behind me on the road, and for a moment the only sound was breathing and wind and the distant mechanical hum of generators inside the facility. Then a voice came over a loudspeaker, amplified and clear. "Survivors on the road, identify yourselves and your numbers." I stepped forward from the column. My clothes were filthy. I had not slept in 3 days. I was carrying a fire axe in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other, and I was aware that I looked like exactly the kind of person a military installation should be wary of. I set the axe on the ground. I set the walkie-talkie next to it. I raised my hands. "My name is Marcus Bowen," I said. "I'm the custodian at Whetstone Academy. I have 308 children with me, plus staff and civilians we collected on the road. The children need food, water, and medical attention. Some of them need it urgently." There was a pause. Then the loudspeaker voice said, "How many adults in your group?" 56. Another pause. Then, "Stand by." We stood. 5 minutes. 10. I was aware of the children behind me, silent, watching, and I was aware that if those gates did not open, I had no contingency, no alternative, no next plan. I had brought 300 children across 70 miles of open country to stand in front of a gate and ask to be let in. And the entire bet rested on the willingness of strangers to see what I saw when I looked at the column behind me. Not a threat, not a liability, not a logistical problem, but 300 reasons to open a gate. The gates opened. They opened slowly, steel on concrete, a sound like the world exhaling. And a woman in military fatigues stepped through with a clipboard and a medical team behind her. And she looked past me to the column, and I watched her face change the way faces change when the scale of something becomes real. She said, "All of them? All children?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, all of them." She said, "Bring them in." I turned and waved the column forward, and the children walked through the gates of Indiantown Gap with the same steady, unhurried, foot in front of foot pace they'd maintained for 5 days. And I stood at the gate and counted every single one of them as they passed, because I had been counting them every day for 45 days, and I was not going to stop now. 308 children entered that facility. Every one who had left Whetstone walked through that gate. Not one missing, not one lost. It was only after the last child was inside, a small boy named Elijah Porter, who had positioned himself at the very end of the column for reasons he never explained to me, that I sat down on the ground outside the gate. Not inside, outside. I sat on the asphalt and put the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed. I breathed for a long time. Tomas came back through the gate and sat down next to me and said nothing. And we stayed like that for a while. 2 people sitting on the ground outside a gate that was open, not needing to go through it yet, because the going through was inevitable and the sitting was necessary. That was 5 months ago. I'm at Indiantown Gap as I record this. The facility is real and it functions. Not comfortably, not easily, but it functions. There are over 2,000 survivors here now. The Whetstone children are housed in a converted barracks that they've decorated with drawings and schedules and lists of rules they wrote themselves. They still run the water brigade every morning, even though the facility has running water, because the habit is theirs, and they are not ready to let it go. Dr. Strauss teaches again. Dr. Adebayo started a new garden. Patricia runs a clinic with actual medical supplies and has not lost a patient since we arrived. Tomas turned 18 last month and was offered a position on the facility's perimeter security team. He took it. I still carry the key ring. Not the one from Whetstone. Those keys are useless now. Artifacts from a building that may or may not still be standing 70 miles away. I carry the one the facility commander gave me when she assigned me to the maintenance division here. It's heavier than the old one. More keys, more doors, more systems to keep running. The work is the same work. Check the locks, check the water, check the walls. Walk the perimeter. Know the building. Keep the building. People here sometimes ask me about the journey, about Whetstone, about what it was like to be responsible for 300 children during the worst weeks of the collapse. I don't know how to answer that question in a way that captures it honestly. What I usually say is that I was not responsible for 300 children. 300 children were responsible for me. They gave me a reason to check the next lock, seal the next window, drive the next supply run, swing the axe when the wall broke open. Without them, the building was just a building. I was just a man with a mop and a set of keys in a world that no longer needed either. They made the keys matter. Every door I locked because a child was sleeping behind it. Every window I boarded because a child's face was on the other side. Every supply run into the dead country beyond the fence, I drove back because 300 faces were waiting for the sound of the truck. I was the janitor. I kept the building. They kept me. Elijah Porter found me in the maintenance shop last week. He's 12 now, taller than when we left Whetstone, still quiet but no longer silent. He stood in the doorway the same way he had 5 months ago and said, "Mr. Bowen, can I help with something?" I handed him a wrench and pointed to the pipe I was working on, and he knelt down next to me and we worked together without talking. And the sound of the wrench on the fitting was the sound of a building being maintained, which is the sound of someone deciding that tomorrow is worth preparing for. That's all survival ever was. Not the axe, not the walls, not the arithmetic of canned goods divided by mouths. It was the decision, made fresh every morning, that the building mattered because the people inside it mattered. And the people inside it mattered because they were alive. And being alive was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be served. I'm still serving it. One door at a time, one lock at a time. One kid standing in the doorway asking to help. The building holds.